History is not a singular, immutable line drawn in the sand. It is a tapestry of infinite threads, and for centuries, we have been told that we are only looking at the finished side of the embroidery. But what if the underside, the tangled, knotted, and discarded threads of what could have been, is being kept from us? Welcome to Shadowed Crown. Today, we step beyond the gilded gates of the Vatican, not to discuss theology, but to investigate a silence that has persisted for 500 years. We are searching for the archive of unwritten outcomes. Deep beneath the marble floors of the Apostolic Palace, where the air is heavy with the scent of ancient parchment and ozone, lies a space that does not appear on any official architectural blueprint. For decades, whispers have persisted among scholars and rogue archivists alike about a collection of 16th century letters. These are not merely administrative records or diplomatic correspondences. They are, if the rumors hold even a shred of truth, a cartography of alternate timelines, a map of realities that were pruned away to ensure the world we inhabit remained the only one permitted to exist. To understand the weight of this claim, we must look back to the late Renaissance, a period of unprecedented intellectual upheaval. It was an era where the boundary between science, mysticism, and theology was blurred. The Vatican, then as now, was the ultimate custodian of human knowledge. Yet, in the shadows of the Reformation, something shifted. Documents recovered from the periphery of the Vatican's private library suggest that certain scholars of the era, men whose names have been scrubbed from the canon, were not just recording history. They were observing the divergence of possibilities. Imagine, if you will, the flickering candlelight of a scriptorium in 1540. A monk, hunched over an illuminated manuscript, is not writing about the lives of saints. He is documenting a series of calculations that describe the trajectory of a Europe that never was. He writes of a technological revolution that ignited centuries too early, or of empires that collapsed not by war, but by the weight of their own premature enlightenment. These letters, often referred to in occult circles as the Chronos correspondence, describe the methodology of what the ancients called the Great Pruning. Why would the Church, or any institution for that matter, feel the need to document and then bury these alternate outcomes? The answer may lie in the nature of power itself. If history is a narrative, then the person who holds the pen has the authority to define reality. If there existed a map of multiple branching timelines, it would imply that our current reality is not an inevitability, but a choice. A choice made by those who sought to maintain a specific, singular order. The evidence is sparse, yet persistent. In 1922, during a routine cataloging of the secret archives, a junior archivist allegedly discovered a series of maps bound in dark, weathered calfskin. These maps did not depict geography as we know it. They depicted the flow of time as a river, with tributaries that branched off into shadowy, unmanifested futures. According to the internal reports that later surfaced in fragmented, unauthorized leaks, the maps were categorized under a label that translates roughly to the Archive of Unwritten Outcomes. Within weeks of this discovery, the archivist was reassigned, and the documents were moved to a restricted subterranean chamber that remains closed to this day. We must ask ourselves, what is the purpose of keeping such records if they are merely fiction? If these letters are just the fever dreams of a Renaissance intellectual, why treat them with the same level of security as the most sensitive papal bulls? The answer, perhaps, is that these records are not just descriptions of alternate history. They are blueprints. They contain the mathematical and philosophical frameworks for understanding why certain events were allowed to unfold, and why others were meticulously suppressed. Consider the implications of a technology that allowed for the observation of these branching paths. If the Vatican possessed a method, whether through esoteric science or forbidden geometry, to influence the outcome of history by observing the potentiality of the future, then the Vatican was not just a religious institution, it was a silent architect of the modern world. This theory suggests that the 16th century was not just a time of religious conflict, but a time of existential selection, where leaders and thinkers decided which version of humanity would survive, and which would be cast into the abyss of the forgotten. As we peel back the layers of this mystery, we encounter the persistent, uncomfortable question of human agency. Are we living in the only reality that could have been? Or are we merely the survivors of a timeline that was carefully pruned by those who believed they knew better? The letters locked beneath the floorboards of the Vatican are said to be written in a cipher that combines Latin with a forgotten, pre-scientific notation. They describe the cost of this stability. They speak of the moral burden of choosing one path while discarding 1,000 others. When we look at the grand architecture of the Vatican, with its towering domes and oppressive, beautiful shadows, we are looking at a monument to a specific kind of certainty. But beneath that certainty lies the restlessness of the suppressed. The archive of unwritten outcomes represents the ghosts of our potential. It represents the inventions that were never allowed to flourish, the philosophies that were silenced before they could take root, and the societies that were dismantled before they could rise. In this investigation, we are not here to claim that the Vatican is a vault of science fiction. We are here to understand why this narrative emerged, and why it continues to haunt the fringes of historical discourse. History is written by the victors, but the mystery of the unwritten is where the true, untold story of humanity resides. As we continue this journey in the coming parts, we will examine the specific figures who are rumored to have accessed these records, and the strange, inexplicable events that occurred in the years following their disappearance. But for now, contemplate the silence of the archives. Think of the thousands of pages hidden away, detailing worlds that might have been better, or perhaps far worse than our own. If you were a guardian of such knowledge, would you burn it to protect the world, or hide it to study the mechanics of reality? The truth, as it often does, lies somewhere in the space between the recorded fact and the whispered possibility. We have only just begun to scratch the surface of the floorboards. The map is there, somewhere, in the dark, waiting for someone to finally read the lines that were never meant to be seen.
History records the year 1582 as a moment of mathematical precision. We are taught that Pope Gregory XIII introduced a new calendar to correct the drift of the Julian system, aligning our seasons once more with the solar cycle. It is a story of astronomical necessity, of scholars gathering in the shadow of the Vatican to restore order to the passage of time. But if we look closer, beyond the dry pages of ecclesiastical records, we find a curiosity that defies standard explanation. Why, in the transition from October 4th to October 15th, did the world lose 10 days of existence? The Gregorian reform was not merely a mechanical adjustment of the clock. In the hushed corridors of the Vatican's secret archives, researchers have stumbled upon letters, private, frantic correspondences between Jesuit astronomers and the papal inner circle, that speak not of solar cycles, but of something far more unsettling: the stabilization of a reality that had begun to fray. Imagine the atmosphere of 16th century Rome. The air is thick with the scent of burning tallow and old parchment. Imagine the scholars, their faces illuminated by the flickering gold of candlelight, hunched over maps that do not depict land masses, but the branching paths of human history. These letters suggest that the drift being corrected
was not just a discrepancy in the Julian calendar's leap year calculation. It was, according to these fragmented texts, a divergence in the timeline itself. The theory, often dismissed as academic heresy, posits that the 16th century was a period of severe ontological instability. It was as if the fabric of human experience had become porous, allowing glimpses of alternate outcomes, realities where the Reformation never ignited, where empires fell in a single night, or where the Renaissance took a darker, more mechanical turn. These letters detail a series of unwritten outcomes, events that threaten to spill over into our own reality, creating a chaotic overlap of histories. Consider the visual of the era, the grand, sweeping architecture of the Vatican, the massive vaulted ceilings casting deep shadows of navy and bronze. In this environment, the Gregorian reform acted as an anchor. By erasing 10 days, the Church was not simply fixing a date. They were performing a surgical excision of a temporal anomaly. It was a calculated intervention to force the world back onto a singular, controlled track, effectively locking away those alternate timelines behind a veil of bureaucratic silence. Why would such a measure be necessary? If we entertain the possibility that the archive of unwritten outcomes exists, we must ask what the Church saw that necessitated such a drastic act. Was it fear, or was it the burden of guardianship? The documents suggest that the Church believed humanity was not prepared for the psychological weight of knowing that their lives were but one of many possible threads. The chaos of choice, the knowledge of paths not taken, could have shattered the social order they worked so tirelessly to maintain. We see this reflected in the art of the period, the strange, surrealist shifts in perspective, the obsession with mirrors, and the recurring motifs of labyrinths. These were not just artistic choices. They were reflections of a collective consciousness struggling to comprehend a world that felt fundamentally unstable. The calendar reform was the final, definitive stroke of the pen that sealed the door. When we observe the transition of those lost 10 days, we are looking at the moment humanity chose a single linear trajectory. We traded the complexity of the multiverse for the security of a unified history. Yet the question remains, what happens to the events that were scheduled for those missing days? Do they simply cease to exist, or do they continue to ripple beneath the floorboards of our current reality, waiting for the right moment to surface? As we peel back the layers of the 1582 anomaly, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a profound mystery. If time is indeed a construct maintained by such interventions, then history is not a fixed monument, but a carefully curated exhibition. The Vatican's archives may hold the blueprints of a reality that could have been, a map of lives. We must reflect on the if our history is a fluid and living, how much of our allegiance is truthful, of the architects of our destiny, or merely walking a path that was clear for us centuries ago. The mystery of the lost days is more than a footnote in an astronomy textbook. It is a fundamental inquiry into the nature of the world we inhabit.
History records the movement of empires, the rise of kings, and the fall of dynasties as if they were singular, inevitable lines drawn across the map of time. We are taught that the past is a fixed monument, unchangeable and absolute. But as we delve deeper into the restricted corridors of the Vatican's hidden archives, we find ourselves confronted with a different geometry altogether. If the documents we have analyzed in the previous chapters are to be believed, the scholars of the 16th century did not view history as a line, but as a vast, branching forest of possibilities. This is what they called the geometry of control. To understand why these letters were buried beneath floorboards and sealed behind leaden doors, we must first suspend our modern skepticism. Imagine, if you will, a cartographer in the year 1540. He is not merely mapping the coastlines of the New World. He is attempting to map the very architecture of human decision-making. These scholars, operating in the shadows of the Counter-Reformation, were obsessed with a concept they termed the unwritten outcomes. They believed that for every major event, a battle, a treaty,
or the rise of a particular leader, there existed a shadow event, a parallel path that was suppressed by the weight of human action. The geometry of control was their attempt to quantify these suppressed paths. They treated history as a mathematical equation, where variables were human choices and constants were the moral laws of the cosmos. In their manuscripts, we find elaborate diagrams, intricate geometric patterns that resemble star charts, yet they are labeled with names of cities, dates of potential treaties, and the names of monarchs who, in our timeline, never held a crown. It is a haunting sensation to look upon a map of Europe drawn in 1550, where borders shift and names change, reflecting a world that exists only in the ink of these parchment pages. Why would the Vatican go to such lengths to conceal these maps? It is not merely a matter of theological heresy, though that is certainly part of it. The deeper fear, perhaps, lies in the implications of the map itself. If one can map the branching paths of history, one can theoretically predict the consequences of one's own actions with terrifying precision. To possess the geometry of alternate timelines is to possess a blueprint for influence. If a governing body held the knowledge of what happens when a nation takes a different turn, they would hold the keys to steering the current of human events. We see this reflected in the peculiar annotations found in the margins of these letters. The authors speak of nodes, points in time where the future is malleable. They describe how, through the manipulation of information or the subtle redirection of resources, one could force reality to collapse into a specific desired outcome. They were not just observing history, they were theorizing about its architecture. They were asking themselves if the world we inhabit is the result of natural progress, or if it is a curated experience, pruned like a bonsai tree to fit a specific theological or political design. Consider the complexity of these documents. They are not the wranglings of madmen. They are written in the precise clinical language of Renaissance mathematics and theology. They employ a system of symbolic logic that mirrors the work of the great polymaths of Lila. When we analyze the ink, the parchment, and the specific composition of the seals, we find they are consistent with the most protected archives of the period. This suggests that the geometry of control was not a fringe thought, but a subject of intense, albeit secret, debate among the intellectual elite of the Church.
History records the year 1582 as a moment of mathematical precision. It was the year Pope Gregory XIII implemented the Gregorian calendar, effectively realigning our world with the solar cycle by erasing 10 days from existence. But in the hushed, climate-controlled depths of the Vatican secret archives, there exists a collection of correspondences that suggest the year 1582 was not merely a calibration of time, but a desperate attempt to sever our reality from another. These are the letters from a ghost timeline. They are written in a cipher that blends Latin with a fragmented, archaic dialect of Venetian, penned by a high-ranking Jesuit cartographer whose name has been systematically scrubbed from every academic ledger. When we look at these documents, we are not looking at the ramblings of a madman. We are looking at the observations of a man who believed he was witnessing a bleed-through, a collision of two distinct iterations of our own Renaissance. The correspondence describes, in chillingly mundane detail, a version of Florence that never was. The writer speaks of a city where the dome of the Duomo was never completed by Brunelleschi, but instead featured a spire of polished obsidian that captured the moonlight, bathing the city in a perpetual, haunting glow. He writes of the Medici family not as patrons of banking and art, but as keepers of a forbidden geometry, mapping the stars to navigate the gaps between what he calls the parallel fold. The right of a world where the plague never took hold, where the scientific revolution occurred in the 14th century, and where the heavens were not a realm of theology, but a reachable frontier. As we analyze these texts, we find ourselves at the intersection of history and theoretical physics.
The Jesuit author expresses a profound, soul-crushing vertigo. He writes of waking up to find that the layout of his own monastery had shifted overnight, that the doors now led to corridors he had never walked, and the faces of his brothers were replaced by men he did not recognize, yet who greeted him as a lifelong companion. He was a man experiencing the instability of his own reality. The Church, in its wisdom, or perhaps its fear, recognized the danger of these manuscripts. If the fabric of reality was indeed porous, and if historical events were merely one of many possible outcomes, then the authority of the Church, and indeed the authority of history itself, would be rendered fragile. To acknowledge the existence of these letters is to admit that our current world is not the inevitable result of human progress, but a chosen path among an infinite, chaotic array of alternatives. When we examine the ink, the parchment, and the wax seals, we are holding the evidence of a crisis of faith that went far beyond religion. It was a crisis of existence. The 1582 reform of the calendar, according to these letters, was not just about the sun and the moon. It was an anchor. By standardizing time, the Vatican may have been attempting to lock humanity into a single, predictable timeline, effectively cauterizing the wounds through which these alternate realities were bleeding into our own. We are left to wonder, are these letters a record of a psychological breakdown in the 16th century, or are they a factual, if terrifying, account of a world that once touched ours? The silence surrounding these documents is heavy, intentional, and absolute. They remain locked away, not because they are inherently evil, but because they challenge the very foundations of how we perceive the past. If we accept that these letters describe a genuine phenomenon, we must ask ourselves what remains of that ghost timeline today. Does it still exist, folded into the fabric of our own, just beyond the reach of our senses? Or was it successfully erased, leaving behind only these fragile, yellowed pages as the final witnesses to a world that was never meant to be? As we peel back the layers of history, we find that the floorboards of the Vatican are not just hiding maps of land and sea, they are hiding the maps of everything that could have been, and perhaps everything that still is. The investigation into these alternate outcomes is not merely an academic exercise, it is a journey into the architecture of our own reality, and the realization that the history we learn is but one thin thread in a vast, dark, and mysterious tapestry. History records the rise and fall of empires, the shifting of borders, and the coronation of kings. We are taught that these events are the inevitable result of human ambition, resource scarcity, and the slow, grinding machinery of progress. But what if the stability we perceive is not the product of chance, but the result of a meticulously curated design? What if the Vatican, throughout the centuries, has functioned not merely as a religious institution, but as a silent architect of our perceived reality? For decades, scholars have whispered about the concept of the archive of unwritten outcomes. It is a theory that suggests the papacy did not just record history, but actively pruned the branches of the timeline that threatened the singularity of their vision. To understand this, one must look past the theological debates and into the administrative records of the 16th century, records that speak of a duty far more profound than the salvation of souls. In the dim, candlelit chambers of the Vatican's secret archives, where the air is heavy with the scent of ancient parchment and dust, there exists documents that defy conventional historical classification. These are not merely letters of correspondence or administrative decrees. They are analytical assessments of divergent possibilities. Imagine, if you will, an intellectual elite, men of immense learning and foresight, tasked with a singular, terrifying responsibility: identifying historical outcomes that would lead to a fractured reality and ensuring they never came to pass. The theory of the papacy as reality architects suggests that the Church viewed history as a living garden. If a particular branch, a scientific discovery, a political movement, or a philosophical shift, threatened to lead humanity down a path of decentralization or chaos, it was deemed an undesirable outcome. The archival letters, some of which remain locked away from modern eyes, detail the subtle interventions required to steer the collective consciousness of the West toward a singular, controlled trajectory. We must ask ourselves how a centralized authority could exert such influence over the vast expanse of human history. The answer, perhaps, lies in the power of information, or more specifically, the suppression of it. By controlling the narrative of what is considered truth, the institution effectively creates a boundary beyond which the human mind is conditioned not to wander. If you control the past, you control the present. And if you have the foresight to map the potential futures, you can preemptively close the doors to any path that does not serve your design. Consider the intellectual climate of the Renaissance and the subsequent age of discovery. While the world was expanding, opening its eyes to new continents and new ways of thinking, the Vatican was simultaneously tightening its grip on the philosophical framework of the era. The Inquisition, in this light, takes on a more complex, almost strategic dimension. It was not merely about suppressing heresy, it was about the containment of reality. Every manuscript burned and every scholar silenced was, in their eyes, a pruning of a chaotic timeline that threatened the structure of the world they sought to maintain. There is a cold, calculated wisdom in this approach. To maintain a singular order in a world of infinite potential is an act of immense, albeit controversial, preservation. The documents stored beneath the floorboards of the Vatican are said to contain calculations, mathematical and theological, that mapped out the ripple effects of specific human decisions. They were, in effect, early systems of risk management, applied not to finance, but to the very fabric of human civilization. Yet we must remain critical. Is it possible for any institution, no matter how powerful, to truly dictate the flow of time? Or are these archives merely the remnants of a desperate attempt to impose order upon an inherently unpredictable world? The very existence of these documents suggests a deep-seated fear, a fear that humanity, if left to its own devices,
History records many maps, charting the known world, the depths of our oceans, and the vast expanse of the celestial heavens. We have spent centuries drawing lines across parchment to define borders, trade routes, and empires. But what if the most significant document ever held within the Vatican Apostolic Archive was never intended to define where we are, but rather where we might have been? For decades, scholars have whispered of the forbidden cartography. It is not a map of land masses or maritime currents, but an atlas of human potential, a forbidden multiverse map, allegedly concealed beneath the very floorboards of the secret archives. We find ourselves standing at the edge of a profound historical inquiry, the archive of unwritten outcomes. The provenance of this theory traces back to the late 16th century, a period of intense theological and scientific upheaval. As the Renaissance began to wane and the scientific revolution took its first tentative steps, the Church found itself the custodian of knowledge that challenged the singular nature of creation. Within the dust-laden shelves of the Vatican, letters written by minor cartographers and anonymous theologians began to circulate, describing a reality that branched like a great oak tree. They spoke of outcomes that never came to pass, battles that were won by the defeated, empires that collapsed before they were born, and lives that drifted into existence only to vanish into the folds of time. These letters, now locked away from human eyes, suggest that the Vatican did not merely store historical records, they curated a ledger of possibilities. If we examine the architectural layout of the secret archives, we see a design that defies the standard logic of storage. Beneath the floorboards of the most restricted chambers, there exist hollowed-out cavities, reinforced with lead, and lined with ancient vellum scrolls that depict geometries no historian can recognize. These are not maps of our Earth. They are projections of divergent timelines, mapped with a precision that suggests the observers were not merely guessing, but witnessing. Why would the institution of the Church, a pillar of singular truth, harbor such volatile information? Perhaps the answer lies in the concept of free will. History records time as a linear progression, a steady march from the past toward an inevitable future. We measure it in seconds, hours, and years, trusting that the calendar is an objective reflection of our existence. But what if time, much like a cartographer's map, was subject to revision? What if the very days we lost to the shadows were not merely errors of calculation, but deliberate erasures of causalities that were never meant to be remembered? Dramatic pause, 3 seconds. Welcome to the 7th movement of our investigation. Today we turn our gaze toward the heavens of the 16th century, where the alignment of stars served as both a compass and a shroud. Investigative tone. In the year 1582, the world underwent a transformation that remains, to this day, one of the most profound administrative shifts in human history. The transition from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar was ostensibly a correction of astronomical drift. Pope Gregory XIII, guided by his advisors, decreed that 10 days be struck from the month of October. On the evening of the 4th, the world simply skipped ahead to the 15th. The official record tells us this was a necessary adjustment to align the liturgical year with the vernal equinox. It was a matter of mathematics, a triumph of science over the imperfection of the solar cycle. Yet, behind the heavy, iron-bound doors of the Vatican Archives, a different conversation was whispered in the corridors of power. Scholars who have spent lifetimes deciphering the fragments of that era suggest that this calendar reform was not merely an exercise in precision. It was an act of synchronization. Consider the implications of losing 10 days. In the eyes of the Church, these days vanished into the ether. But in the context of the archive of unwritten outcomes, those 10 days represent a temporal void. If the letters we have been tracing, those maps of alternate timelines, are to be believed, certain celestial alignments were viewed by Renaissance astronomers as windows. They believed that when the planets reached specific, rare configurations, the veil between what happened and what could have happened became dangerously thin. By deleting those specific 10 days, the architects of the Gregorian reform may have effectively severed the connection to a series of causalities that were beginning to manifest. It was a surgical excision of history. If an alternate path of human development had begun to take root, if a different version of our reality had begun to bleed into the collective consciousness, the sudden, forced shift in the calendar served as a reset button, a way to ensure that the clockwork of the world remained locked to the path approved by the powers that be. Why would the Vatican go to such lengths? We must remember that in the 16th century, the Church was not merely a religious institution. It was the curator of reality itself. To acknowledge that time could be fluid, or that there were unwritten outcomes waiting to be lived, would have shattered the foundations of divine order. If the stars dictated a destiny that contradicted the official narrative, then the stars, or at least our observation of them, had to be brought into compliance. Deep within the archives, there exist marginalia in documents dated just prior to the reform. These are not the works of theologians, but of mathematicians and astronomers who served the papacy. Their notes describe celestial patterns that do not appear in any modern star chart. They speak of silent erasures, moments when the sky seemed to hold its breath, and the causal links between cause and effect were momentarily severed. They feared that if these alignments were allowed to pass without intervention, the fabric of our consensus reality would unravel. Imagine a map of the multiverse, not drawn on parchment, but etched into the very rotation of the Earth and the alignment of the stars. The letters hidden beneath the floorboards of the Vatican suggest that the 1582 reform was the final step in a long-term project to collapse these possibilities. By standardizing time, they standardized the outcome of human history. But one question remains, haunting in its simplicity. What was the nature of the reality that was erased? Was it a world where technology flourished beyond the constraints of the medieval mind? Was it a society that looked towards the stars not with fear, but with the understanding that we are merely one iteration of a vast, unfolding cosmic design? We see the evidence in the architecture of that period, the sudden shift in artistic expression, the suppression of certain scientific inquiries, and the meticulous documentation of heretical visions that described worlds which looked nothing like the one we inhabit. These were not hallucinations. They were glimpses of the outcomes that were struck from the record. As we stand here, centuries later, we are living in the wake of that adjustment. The rhythm of our lives, the very way we perceive the passing of a year,
is a construct designed to keep us anchored to a single, narrow path. We are conditioned to believe that history is fixed, that it is a stone monument that cannot be moved. Yet the existence of these letters, the persistence of the rumors, and the strange, inexplicable gaps in our historical records suggest otherwise. The stars are still moving, just as they did in the 16th century. The patterns, however, are now obscured by the filter of our own perception. We live in a world that has been curated, a timeline that has been pruned of its wilder, more complex branches. But the archives are not impenetrable. The truth doesn't disappear simply because we have forgotten how to count the days. We reflect on the silence of those 10 lost days. We must wonder, if time is a map, who holds the pen? And what happens when we finally decide to look at the areas of the map that were left blank? The investigation into the archive of unwritten outcomes is not just a search for old papers or forgotten secrets. It is an invitation to question the very nature of the reality we accept as a truth. History is not what happened. History is what we have been told to remember. And perhaps the most important part of the story is not in what was written down, but in what was carefully, meticulously erased. As we move forward, we must ask ourselves if we are ready to see the world as it truly is, rather than as it has been made for us. The alignment of the stars is shifting once again, and the silence of the archives is beginning, ever so slightly, to fade. Dramatic pause for 4 seconds.
History records the passage of time as a singular, unbreakable thread. We are taught that what has happened is immutable, a fixed sequence of cause and effect that leads us to the present moment. But as we have explored through these fragments, the Vatican's hidden archives suggest a different reality, one where the thread was once frayed and perhaps even severed. Today, we turn our attention to the final decrypted fragments of the Archive of Unwritten Outcomes. These are not merely notes on history. They are the blueprints of worlds that never breathed. For centuries, these documents remained dormant beneath the floorboards of the secret archives, written in a cipher that blended Latin, Aramaic, and a mathematical shorthand that predates modern calculus. When we finally bridge the gap between the 16th century ink and our contemporary understanding, a chilling realization emerges. These letters do not describe the world as it was. They describe the world as it almost became. And more importantly, the strategic decisions taken to ensure those outcomes remained unwritten. Imagine a map, not of land, but of causality. The scholars who penned these letters were obsessed with what they called the Great Divergence. They believed that specific historical junctures, the signing of a treaty, the death of a monarch, the discovery of a specific alchemical formula, were not singular events, but crossroads. In the eyes of these silent archivists, the Vatican was not merely a spiritual institution, but a silent moderator of reality itself. They viewed their role as the architects of a singular, stable timeline, actively pruning the possibilities that threatened to collapse the social and theological order of their time. One fragment, dated to the winter of 1542, details a sequence of events concerning a maritime exploration. We know from our textbooks that this expedition was lost at sea, a tragedy of navigation. However, the Archive of Unwritten Outcomes tells a different story. In the alternate timeline detailed in these letters, the expedition reached a landmass far to the west, discovering a source of energy or material that would have accelerated the Industrial Revolution by 300 years. The letters describe the resulting technological upheaval as a catastrophe of morality, a world where human capacity for destruction outpaced our capacity for wisdom. The archivists did not mourn the loss of the ships. They recorded the prevention of a premature modernity. The weight of this discovery is profound. It forces us to ask, are we the beneficiaries of a divine plan, or are we the survivors of a calculated suppression? The tone of these manuscripts is not one of triumph, but of weary obligation. There is an unmistakable sense of burden in the handwriting, a recurring theme of sacrifice. They speak of the weight of the unseen, a philosophy that suggests the more a civilization knows about its potential alternatives, the less it can function in the present. By hiding these maps, by locking away the letters detailing alternate timelines,
They believed they were protecting humanity from the paralyzing weight of what if. As we analyze the patterns within these records, we see a recurring obsession with the stability of the human spirit. The archivists feared that if humanity realized that reality was fluid, that the past could have been radically different, the foundational structures of faith, law, and governance would dissolve into chaos. They viewed the multiverse not as a scientific wonder, but as an existential threat to the singular truth they were sworn to uphold. Yet, we must remain critical. Are these letters truly evidence of a hidden multiverse, or are they the frantic, highly imaginative musings of a group of scholars who became lost in the labyrinth of their own intellectual isolation? Perhaps the archive of unwritten outcomes is not a factual record of alternate realities, but a psychological study of the fear of change. Even if the timeline is fixed, the existence of these documents proves that the human mind has long wrestled with the idea that our existence is fragile, and that the path we walk is only one of many possibilities. We stand now at the end of this particular investigation, peering into a darkness that has been curated for 500 years. We see the shadows of empires that never rose, and the echoes of inventions that were dismantled before they could be conceived. The Vatican remains silent, as it is its tradition, but the documents are here, in the light of our scrutiny, forcing us to confront the nature of our own history. Perhaps the greatest secret is not that there was a map of alternate timelines hidden beneath the floorboards. Perhaps the secret is that history itself is a fragile construct, maintained by those who believe they know what is best for the collective soul of humanity. As we walk away from these archives, we are left with a lingering philosophical question. If we were given the power to rewrite the past, to choose one of these unwritten outcomes, would you have the wisdom to bear the consequences? Or is the mystery of our own singular, unfolding one the only trick we were ever meant to possess? History is indeed written by the victors, but this work of Joe, it is often edited by those who feel the infinite possibilities of the unknown.
History records the rise and fall of empires as singular, linear threads of time. We are taught that the past is a fixed monument, carved in stone, unchangeable and absolute. But as we have journeyed through these archives, we have encountered a chilling possibility that history is not a line, but a labyrinth. And within the deepest, most secure chambers of the Vatican, there exists a map, not of our world, but of the paths we did not take. In this final investigation, we arrive at the most profound moral dilemma of all. We must ask ourselves, what is the price of a single reality? And who, if anyone, has the authority to decide which version of humanity survives and which is relegated to the shadows of the unwritten? Imagine a 16th century scribe, his quill trembling, not from age, but from the weight of his task. He is not merely recording events, he is cataloging outcomes. Before him lies the archive of unwritten outcomes, a collection of letters and diagrams detailing timelines that diverged from our own. Perhaps a plague that was averted in one reality, but decimated another. Perhaps a kingdom that stood for 1,000 years in a parallel existence, while ours crumbled in the dust of the Dark Ages. Dramatic pause. The institutional silence surrounding these documents is not necessarily born of malice, but of a burden so heavy it threatens the very foundation of human certainty. To admit that all reality is merely one of many is to strip away the illusion of cosmic importance. It suggests that our struggles, our triumphs, and our suffering are but one variation in an infinite sequence of possibilities. Consider the ethical implications. If an institution held the knowledge that a specific decision, a treaty signed, a battle won, a discovery suppressed, would lead to the collapse of a timeline, would they be acting as guardians or as executioners? If they chose to steer the course of history toward a specific, stable outcome,
They would effectively be pruning the tree of existence, deciding which branches of humanity would flourish and which would be severed. This is the central mystery of the archive. We see the influence of this philosophy in the strategic, almost surgical precision of historical events that seem to defy logical explanation. Why were certain technologies suppressed while others were accelerated? Why did the Church, at critical junctures, pivot its theological focus just as the world stood on the brink of radical change? If we view these moments through the lens of the multiverse map, we see a pattern of preservation. It is a cold, calculated effort to maintain a singular, coherent narrative for mankind. Yet, there is a profound sadness in this realization. If our path has been curated, if the chaotic beauty of our history has been shaped by the unseen hands of those who fear the divergence of timelines, then what becomes of free will? Are we the architects of our own destiny? Or are we merely actors in a play whose script was edited centuries ago to ensure the survival of this specific reality? The documents locked away beneath the floorboards do not just contain secrets. They contain ghosts. They are the echoes of billions of lives that might have been. They represent the triumphs that were never celebrated and the tragedies that were never felt in our world. By keeping these records hidden, the custodians of the Vatican are not just protecting a secret, they are maintaining the structural integrity of our perceived existence. They act as the anchors of our reality, preventing us from drifting into the overwhelming realization that there are infinite other ways the world could have told. As we stand at the threshold of this final revelation, we must reflect on the nature of truth. Is a truth that threatens the stability of the human psyche a burden that should be shared, or a secret that must be kept at all costs? The archive of unwritten outcomes suggests that there is a heavy price for knowing the alternative. It suggests that the comfort of a singular history is a fragile shield against the infinite complexity of the multiverse. Perhaps the reason these letters remain in the dark is not to deceive us, but to protect us. To gaze upon the map of what could have been is to lose the sense of purpose that drives us forward. If we knew that our choices were but one of an infinite set, would we still strive with the same passion? Would we still love, create, and build with the same intensity? Dramatic pause. History is a conversation between the past and the future. By investigating these hidden corners, we are not trying to dismantle the past, but to understand the depth of the foundation upon which we stand. The Vatican may hold the map, but we hold the present. Whether our reality is a natural occurrence or a carefully curated path, the weight of our current choices remains entirely our own. We have traced the shadows, we have analyzed the ink, and we have listened to the silence of the archives. While the map of the multiverse may never be unfolded for the world to see, the questions it raises will continue to echo through the corridors of time. The secret may remain beneath the floorboards, but the realization that we are part of a much larger, more complex tapestry of existence is now a part of our own history. As we close this chapter, we are left not with an answer, but with a new way of seeing. The world is far larger, far stranger, and far more connected than we ever dared to imagine. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most important truth of all. The mystery remains, inviting us to look closer, to think deeper, and to always, always question the nature of the reality we call our own.
History records the footprints of humanity in ink and stone. Yet there are moments when the path seems to shift beneath our feet. We walk through life with a sense of continuity, a belief that yesterday is a solid foundation upon which today is built. But what if that foundation is not as singular as we have been led to believe? What if the past is not a straight line, but a complex tapestry, heavily pruned by those who held the shears? For decades, scholars and researchers have circled a peculiar phenomenon, a collective dissonance that modern culture has labeled the Mandela effect. It is the strange sensation of remembering an event, a name, or a detail with absolute clarity, only to find that the official record stands in direct contradiction to your memory. Most dismiss this as the fallibility of the human mind, a simple neurological glitch. But as we delve deeper into the archive of unwritten outcomes, we must ask a more profound question. Could these instances of collective memory be the residual echoes of timelines that were once real, but were subsequently erased? In our investigation into the Vatican's hidden maps, we have uncovered references to what the authors called the pruning. It was not a physical destruction of lands or peoples, but a metaphysical excision, a process of collapsing divergent possibilities into a single approved narrative. The 16th century letters we have examined speak of a methodology, a sophisticated application of geometry and theology designed to harmonize the world's progression. If reality is, as some ancient texts suggest, a manifestation of collective observation, then controlling the narrative of history is the ultimate instrument of control. Imagine, if you will, the power held by those who curate the archives. If you can define what happened in the past, you define the boundaries of what is possible in the future. The letters suggest that the Vatican's vault contains more than just maps. It contains the blueprints of the realities that were discarded. When a timeline was deemed non-conducive to the stability of the established order, it was treated as a cartographic error. It was redacted. But memory is a stubborn thing. It does not always adhere to the ink of the official ledger. When thousands of people remember a world that does not exist in the history books, we are not necessarily witnessing a mass delusion. We may be witnessing the ghosts of a timeline that was pruned away. These are the echoes of the discarded. Consider the architectural anomalies we have studied throughout this series. The grand cathedrals, the hidden chambers beneath the Vatican, the precise alignment of ancient monuments. These are not merely structures of worship. They are anchors. They were built to lock the current iteration of reality into place, to ensure that the stream of time flows within the designated channels. The maps hidden beneath the floorboards were not meant to chart geography. They were meant to monitor the drift of consciousness. When we experience a moment of dissonance, when the world feels slightly out of sync with our internal compass, we are brushing against the seams of these hidden maps. The archival documents suggest that the Vatican was intensely concerned with these anomalies, documenting each instance of mass memory discrepancy as a failure of the containment protocol. They feared that if too many people remembered the alternate outcome, the collapse of that timeline would be incomplete. The pruned branches would begin to sprout again. It is a sobering thought, is it not, to realize that our perception of truth might be a curated experience. The history we study in schools is the history that was permitted to survive. But the whispers of what could have been persist. They persist in our folklore, in our recurring dreams, and in the persistent, nagging feeling that the world was once different, brighter, or perhaps darker than the one we inhabit today. We are not suggesting that history is a lie, but rather that it is a selection. Every historical narrative is a choice, and every choice leaves behind a trail of what was rejected. The Vatican's archives are the final resting place of these rejected possibilities. History records the rise and fall of empires, the signing of treaties, and the silent passing of popes. We are taught that the Vatican Archives are a repository of the past, a vault of paper and ink documenting the linear progression of human civilization. But as we have peeled back the layers of this 11-part investigation, the evidence suggests a far more complex reality. We are no longer looking at a library of what happened. We are looking at a ledger of what could have been, and perhaps what currently is. For decades, scholars have whispered about the floorboards of the Archivum Secretum. It is not merely a metaphor for hidden storage. It is a geographic marker. Deep beneath the modern foundations of the Apostolic Palace, there exists a chamber that does not appear on any structural blueprint. It is here that the 16th century letters, those strange, frantic correspondences between Jesuit astronomers and anonymous cartographers, find their origin. They were not writing about geography on Earth. They were mapping the branching paths of existence itself. The ultimate secret, the one that has remained shielded from human eyes for 500 years, is that the Vatican is not merely hiding history. They are guarding a gateway. The concept of the multiverse, which modern physics now debates as a mathematical probability, was in the 1500s an operational reality for a select few within the Holy See. These figures realized that the timeline we occupy, the one defined by our wars, our breakthroughs, and our limitations, is but one thread in a vast woven tapestry. Consider the implications of the archive of unwritten outcomes. Why would a religious institution, tasked with the salvation of souls, be so obsessed with the mechanics of alternate realities? The answer lies in the nature of control. If one can observe the consequences of a decision before it is fully realized in this dimension, one becomes the architect of destiny. The letters we examined in our previous chapters were not just observations. They were reports from observers who were monitoring these divergent timelines to ensure that the primary outcome, the one that maintains the current power structure of the Church, remains the dominant one. The architecture of this hidden chamber is said to be non-Euclidean, designed with a precision that defies the engineering capabilities of the Renaissance. Imagine a room where the light does not fall in straight lines, where the shadows move independently of the candles, and where the air carries the metallic scent of static electricity. This is the heart of the Vatican's most guarded secret. It is a place where the barrier between what is and what might have been is paper thin. We must approach this with intellectual rigor. If such a gateway exists, it implies that our history is not a series of random occurrences. It suggests that our world is a curated experiment. The Vatican's role, as suggested by these forbidden documents, has been that of a gardener. They have pruned the branches of our collective reality, clipping away the timelines that posed a threat to their influence, and nurturing those that guaranteed their endurance. That's why the silence from the Vatican has been so absolute. To acknowledge the existence of these letters is to admit that the Church has been operating as a silent overseer of the multiverse for centuries. It transforms the narrative of theology into one of quantum mechanics and existential management. It forces us to ask, if our history is being managed from a room beneath the floorboards, how much of our free will is truly our own? The documents describe a specific mechanism, a navigator's map, that allowed the Vatican's inner circle to track the shifts in reality. It was not a physical map in the traditional sense, but a series of shifting geometric patterns, etched into bronze plates that reacted to the atmospheric pressure of the chamber. When a major historical event was about to occur, these plates would vibrate, reflecting the potential outcomes. The duty of the Guardian was to ensure the correct outcome was solidified, often through subtle intervention in the political affairs of the time. Yet, even with such power, there was a palpable sense of fear within these letters. The authors were not masters of the multiverse. They were its territorial servants. They understood that the people theory was the branching paths. They were creating a dead map of the multiverse. If we could have done using the work, from the good of our projects would become too good to manage. We would call As we conclude this investigation into the archive of unwritten outcomes, we are not left with a definitive answer, but with a mirror held up to our own perception of time. History is not a fixed, immutable record.
It is a living, breathing, and potentially fluid entity. Whether or not the Vatican possesses the keys to the multiverse, the mystery itself has changed the way we view the past. It reminds us that every choice we make, every turning point in our own lives, ripples outward into the unknown. Perhaps the most important lesson is not what lies beneath the floorboards of the Vatican, but what lies within the choices of the present. We are the authors of the current timeline. Whether we are being steered or whether we are forging our own path, the responsibility to understand our history remains the most powerful tool we possess. The gate may be hidden, but the path forward is ours to define. The investigation into the Vatican's secret may end here, but the inquiry into the nature of our own existence has only just begun.
History records that the architecture of our world is built upon layers of foundational choices. For centuries, we have walked upon the floorboards of the Vatican's archives, never suspecting that beneath the dust of ancient parchments lies a cartography of roads not taken. We have reached the final threshold of our investigation, a point where the distinction between what is real and what is curated begins to blur. The archive of unwritten outcomes is not merely a collection of letters. It is a testament to a deliberate pruning of human potential. When we examine the 16th century correspondences locked away in these subterranean vaults, we are not looking at works of fiction. We are looking at the discarded blueprints of reality. These documents detail timelines where the trajectory of scientific advancement, geopolitical borders, and even the fundamental understanding of consciousness shifted in directions that were deemed incompatible with the stability of our current epoch. Consider the weight of such a secret. If a governing body or a collective of custodians held the power to observe the branching paths of causality, they would inevitably face the burden of selection. To maintain the reality we currently inhabit, others must be suppressed. This is the essence of the curated existence. We live within a perimeter, a garden walled off from the wilder, more chaotic possibilities of the multiverse. The letters suggest that our history is not a singular, inevitable march toward the present, but a managed harvest. Why, one must ask, would such information be hidden? Perhaps it is not out of malice, but out of a perceived necessity for order. Human history is a fragile tapestry. If the masses were to discover that their struggles, their triumphs, and their very identities were merely one version of 1,000 possible lives, the social contract might dissolve. The authorities of the past, and perhaps the present, have operated under the assumption that the truth is a dangerous burden, one that could destabilize the delicate balance of civilization. We must reflect on the nature of our own agency. If our reality is a result of archival pruning, are we the architects of our destiny, or are we the characters in a story whose plot has already been edited? This is the core of the mystery that has haunted our investigation. We look at the great monuments of the world, the epic architecture that defines our history, and we see them as milestones. But what if they are markers of the boundaries? What if the monuments we build are intended to anchor us to this specific timeline, preventing us from drifting into the currents of those discarded outcomes? The scholars who penned these letters were not madmen. They were observers who caught a glimpse of the mechanism behind the curtain. They documented the shifts in the tides of time, noting how a single decision in a royal court or a singular discovery in a laboratory could collapse a potential future, rendering it invisible to the eyes of history. They wrote of the weight of the unchosen, the ghosts of the timelines that were extinguished so that ours could flourish. As we stand at the end of this inquiry, we are left with a profound sense of wonder. We are not just participants in a linear timeline, we are the survivors of a grand selection process. The darkness that hides these archives is not meant to keep us out, but to keep the nature of our reality in.
It is a protective shroud intended to preserve the integrity of the world as it has been ordained. Yet the questions remain. If these alternate outcomes are truly unwritten, why do they persist in the memories of our collective intuition?